The flames had barely stopped smoking when my father stood in his oversized driveway, arms crossed, and told me I could sleep in my car. Behind him, through the bay windows of his 4-bedroom house, I could see my stepmother Linda arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. My half-siblings Connor and Emma were playing video games on their massive sectional sofa. There was a guest room. There were 2 guest rooms, actually. I knew because I'd helped paint them 6 years ago, back when Dad still pretended I was part of the family. "Dad, please," I heard myself say, hating the crack in my voice. My eyes were still burning from the smoke, my clothes reeked of ash, and I had exactly $47 in my checking account until next Friday's paycheck. The firefighters had just told me I couldn't enter what remained of my house for at least 72 hours. Maybe longer. Everything I owned was either destroyed or contaminated. Just for tonight. I'll figure something out tomorrow. He actually looked annoyed, like I was asking him to donate a kidney instead of offering me a couch for one night. "Linda and I have discussed this, Morgan. We have a routine with the kids. Your drama would be disruptive," he said. "Your drama, as if I'd set the fire myself for attention. You're an adult, you have friends. Figure it out." I stood there and borrowed firefighter's blanket, watching my father's face. The same face that used to read me bedtime stories, that walked me down the aisle at my college graduation, and saw absolutely nothing. No concern, no guilt. Just mild irritation that I was standing on his property. Linda appeared at the door then, her perfectly manicured hand resting on the frame. "Richard, dinner's getting cold." She looked at me with the same expression she'd give a door-to-door salesperson. "Morgan, honey, I'm sure you understand. The children have school tomorrow and we can't have chaos in the house." The way she said chaos made it clear what she really meant. I can't have you in my house. Something inside me crystallized in that moment. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too immediate. This was colder, clearer. "I understand perfectly," I said quietly. I pulled the firefighter's blanket tighter around my shoulders and turned toward my car. Behind me, I heard their front door close with a definitive click, followed by the electronic beep of their security system being armed. I sat in my 15-year-old Honda Civic, the one thing the fire hadn't touched since it was parked at work, and made 3 phone calls. The first was to my best friend Jamie, who immediately invited me to her apartment. The second was to my insurance company to start the claims process. The third was to the storage unit facility where I'd been keeping boxes of my mother's things since college. In those boxes was something I'd forgotten about until that moment, standing in my father's driveway. The original deed to my grandmother's property. The land where my father had built his construction company headquarters 20 years ago. The land he'd claimed in probate court was gifted to him before she died, despite my grandmother's will clearly stating it was to be held in trust for me until I turned 25. I'd been too young to fight it then, too grief-stricken over losing both my mother and grandmother within 3 years. But I wasn't that lost girl anymore. As I drove to Jamie's apartment, I caught myself smiling in the rearview mirror. Not a happy smile. A knowing smile, because what my father didn't realize, what he'd never bothered to learn since marrying Linda and starting his perfect new family, was that I'd spent the last 3 years working as an office manager for one of Portland's top property litigation attorneys. And I knew exactly how to research property fraud. Jamie's apartment was small but felt like a palace compared to my father's driveway. She made up her couch with clean sheets, brought me tea, and didn't ask questions when I spent that first night filling a legal pad with notes instead of sleeping. The storage unit visit the next morning confirmed what I'd remembered. My grandmother's original will, notarized and witnessed, clearly stated that the 12-acre property on Southeast Morrison Street was to be held in trust for me until my 25th birthday. My father had been named temporary trustee, authorized only to maintain the property, not to use it commercially or transfer ownership. I photographed every page with my phone, hands steady despite the implications crystallizing in my mind. By that afternoon, I'd pulled the county property records. The land had been transferred into my father's name 3 months after my grandmother's death, when I was 16 and drowning in grief over losing my mother just 2 years earlier. The transfer documents claimed a gift deed executed 6 months before her death. But I'd spent every weekend of that period with my grandmother. She'd been planning my future, talking about how the property would give me security, help me start my life. She hadn't been giving it away. I compared the signature on the gift deed to other documents in the storage boxes. The loops were wrong. The pressure inconsistent. Someone had forged her signature. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Insurance adjusters need to inspect your property. I've arranged it for Thursday. You're welcome. I stared at that message for a long moment. He was doing the bare minimum, making one phone call, and expected gratitude. Meanwhile, he'd locked me out of his house while sitting on property he'd stolen from me, property worth roughly $2-3 million in Portland's current market. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to myself at 3 different accounts. Wednesday morning, I showed up at work early. My boss, Catherine Walsh, found me in the conference room surrounded by printed property records. She didn't ask why I looked like I'd slept in my clothes, which I had, technically, since these were borrowed from Jamie's closet. She just brought coffee and sat down. Property dispute? She asked, scanning the documents with her attorney's eye. Family matter, I said carefully. Hypothetically, if someone forged a deed transfer for property worth millions, but the real owner was a minor at the time and didn't discover the fraud until recently, would there be recourse? Catherine's expression sharpened. In Oregon, fraud has no statute of limitations if you can prove the fraud was actively concealed. Property fraud specifically can be challenged within 6 years of discovery. She looked at me directly. This is you, isn't it? I nodded slowly. My father transferred my grandmother's property to himself using what I believe is a forged gift deed. I was 16 and grieving when it happened. I just found the original will. Catherine pulled the documents closer, her professional demeanor sliding into place. How much is the property worth? He built his construction company headquarters on it. Current valuation around $2-3 million. She let out a low whistle. And let me guess, he's not offering to help you after your house burned down? He told me to sleep in my car. Something flashed across Catherine's face, the same cold clarity I'd felt in my father's driveway. I'll make some calls, quietly. We'll need a handwriting analyst, original documents authenticated, and a full title search. This will get expensive before it pays off. I have insurance money coming from the house fire, I said, and I'm willing to go into debt for this. That afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. Ms. Carter, this is Deputy Martinez with the Portland Fire Marshal's office. We've completed our investigation into your house fire. The origin point was your electrical panel, but we found something concerning. Would you be available to meet tomorrow? My stomach dropped. Concerning how? The panel showed signs of tampering. Someone had bypassed several safety features, essentially creating a fire waiting to happen. We're classifying this as possible arson. Do you have any enemies who might want to harm you? I sat down hard on Jamie's couch, my mind racing. When was the tampering done? Based on the oxidation patterns sometime in the last 6 months? Did you have any electrical work done recently? 6 months ago, my father had insisted on inspecting my house after I'd mentioned some flickering lights. He'd brought one of his construction workers, spent an hour in the basement, and told me everything was fine. I'd believed him because he was my father. Deputy Martinez, I said slowly, I think I need to make a formal statement, and I'm going to need my insurance company involved in this conversation. After I hung up, I sat staring at my phone. My father hadn't just stolen from me. He'd actively tried to destroy the one asset I had left, my house, probably hoping I'd be desperate enough to accept whatever scraps he offered, too broken to fight back about anything else. He'd miscalculated badly. That evening, my phone rang again. Linda's number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Morgan? Linda's voice was tight, artificially sweet. Richard mentioned you might need some help with temporary housing. We've reconsidered, and we'd be happy to have you stay with us for a few weeks while you sort things out. I leaned back against Jamie's couch, understanding flooding through me. What changed? A pause. Nothing changed. We're family. We should have offered immediately. Linda, what happened? Why are you really calling? Another pause. Longer this time. Richard received a call today from someone at the county assessor's office. Something about a property title review. He's been very stressed. Her voice dropped lower. He said you've been asking questions about your grandmother's land. Morgan, please don't cause problems. Think about Connor and Emma. They don't need drama. There it was. They knew I was investigating, and they were scared. Tell Dad I'll think about it, I said neutrally. Thanks for the offer. I hung up before she could respond, then immediately called Catherine. They know I'm looking into the property fraud. My stepmother just called trying to smooth things over. Good, Catherine said crisply. That means they know they're vulnerable. Don't accept anything from them. Not money, not housing, not apologies. Every interaction now is potential evidence. Document everything. By Friday, I had a meeting scheduled with a handwriting analyst, a title attorney, and a criminal defense lawyer Catherine had recommended. Because if the fire marshal's investigation went where I thought it would, my father wasn't just facing civil fraud charges. I also had a recorded voicemail from my father's driveway conversation, saved by a neighbor's doorbell camera that had captured audio of him telling me to sleep outside hours after my house burned down. The neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had seen me on the news being interviewed by reporters about the fire and recognized me. She'd offered the footage without being asked, clearly horrified by what she'd witnessed. "I've known Richard for 15 years, Mrs. Chen had said, handing me a thumb drive with the video file. "I've never liked him, but I didn't know he was cruel. You use this however you need to, honey." That night, I finally allowed myself to feel the weight of everything. Jamie found me crying in her bathroom, not from sadness, but from pure rage. She sat on the tile floor with me, her arm around my shoulders. "He tried to burn down my house," I whispered. "His own daughter's house, so I'd be desperate, so I'd have nothing." "But you're not desperate," Jamie said firmly. "You're dangerous, and he has no idea what's coming." She was right. My father had spent so long dismissing me, excluding me, treating me like an inconvenient remnant of his past life, that he'd forgotten I was capable of fighting back. He'd underestimated me the same way he'd underestimated my mother and grandmother, assuming women were too emotional, too weak, too forgiving to demand what was owed. Monday morning, I walked into the Portland Fire Marshal's office with documentation showing my father's access to my house, his expertise in electrical systems, and his financial motivation to destroy my only asset. Deputy Martinez listened carefully, then made a call to the arson investigation unit. By Wednesday, I'd filed a formal complaint with the Oregon State Bar against the attorney who'd processed my grandmother's fraudulent deed transfer, an old friend of my father's who'd since retired, but whose license could still be revoked for ethics violations. By Friday, exactly 2 weeks after my house burned down, I had enough evidence compiled to file a civil lawsuit for property fraud and a separate criminal complaint for arson conspiracy. I scheduled both filings for the same morning, ensuring they'd become public record simultaneously. My father's carefully constructed life, his reputation in Portland's construction industry, his family man image, his financial security built on stolen land, was about to collapse. And I was going to watch every second of it. The lawsuit hit public records on a Tuesday morning. By noon, my phone had 17 missed calls from my father's number and 6 from Linda. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I sat in Catherine's office while she walked me through what would happen next. The arson investigation is proceeding independently of our civil case, but they're complementary. The fire marshal has referred your father to the district attorney's office. They're taking it seriously, Morgan. Arson with intent to defraud insurance is a Class B felony in Oregon. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. How long before he's arrested? They'll want to build a solid case first. Weeks, maybe months. But the civil fraud case will move faster. She tapped the stack of documents between us. The handwriting analyst confirmed what we suspected. The signature on the gift deed doesn't match your grandmother's authenticated signatures. Moreover, your grandmother's estate attorney, the one who drafted her original will, is willing to testify that she never mentioned gifting the property to your father. In fact, she specifically discussed maintaining it as your inheritance. I closed my eyes briefly. Why didn't he speak up during probate? He wasn't notified. Your father used a different attorney to process the estate, someone who conveniently didn't involve any of your grandmother's actual legal representatives. Catherine's expression hardened. This was premeditated fraud, Morgan. Your father planned this while your grandmother was dying. The next day, a reporter from the Oregonian called me. Someone had tipped them off about the lawsuit, probably a clerk in the county recorder's office who'd recognized my father's name. Richard Carter was semi-prominent in Portland, his construction company responsible for several high-profile commercial projects. "Ms. Carter, can you confirm you're suing your father for fraud?" the reporter asked. I took a breath, thinking about all the times my father had told me to stay quiet, be grateful, not cause problems. Yes, I can confirm that. My father fraudulently transferred property that my grandmother left to me in her will. I was 16 when it happened, grieving my mother and grandmother. He took advantage of that grief to steal my inheritance. Your house recently burned down. Is there any connection? The Portland Fire Marshal's office is investigating possible arson. I've provided them with information about who had access to my home and who might have financial motivation to destroy it. The article ran the next morning, front page of the Metro section. By that afternoon, 3 of my father's former employees had contacted Catherine's office with their own stories of financial irregularities and fraud. One had been pressured to falsify permit inspections. Another had witnessed my father billing clients for materials that were never delivered. A third claimed my father had deliberately overbilled a non-profit housing project by nearly $200,000. The house of cards was toppling faster than I'd anticipated. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You're destroying your family. Dad's reputation is ruined. Connor asked why people at school are saying Dad's a criminal. You're hurting innocent kids." Emma's phone. I stared at that message for a long time. My father had clearly dictated it, using my 9-year-old half-brother's distress as a weapon. It was so typical of him. Hide behind children, claim victimhood, make me the villain for demanding what was mine. I took a screenshot and forwarded it to Catherine without responding. That weekend, I finally went to see what remained of my house. The structure was still standing, but the interior was destroyed. Everything I'd owned was either ash or smoke damaged beyond recovery. Photo albums from my childhood, my mother's jewelry, books she'd given me, all gone. I stood in what used to be my bedroom and felt the weight of what my father had done. This wasn't just about money or property. He'd tried to erase me. Erase my past, my security, my independence, make me so desperate that I'd have to come crawling back to him. Accept his conditional love, his control, his version of family where I was always the outsider looking in. But he'd left evidence. The electrical panel, charred and twisted, showed clear signs of tampering. The fire marshal had already removed it for analysis. My father's construction worker, the one who'd inspected my house 6 months ago, had already been interviewed by investigators. According to Catherine's sources, he was cooperating fully, claiming he'd been ordered to make the panel less stable, but hadn't understood it would cause a fire. My father was drowning, and I felt no sympathy. Monday morning brought another development. The district attorney's office issued a formal notice that they were investigating my father for insurance fraud, arson conspiracy, and criminal property theft. My father would need to appear for questioning within the week. That afternoon, Linda called from yet another number. This time I answered. "Morgan, please." Her voice was ragged, desperate. "Richard made mistakes. He knows that now. But this has gone too far. His business is collapsing. Clients are canceling contracts. The bank is asking questions about his assets. We could lose everything." "Good," I said flatly. "Connor and Emma don't deserve this. They're innocent children." "I was an innocent child when he stole my inheritance. I was his daughter when he told me to sleep in my car. Where was your concern then?" He panicked. He didn't mean, "Linda, he burned down my house. Do you understand that? He didn't just refuse to help me. He actively tried to destroy me. And you stood in your doorway and told me I was too chaotic for your perfect household." Silence, then quieter. "I didn't know about the fire. Richard swears he didn't. The evidence says otherwise. The DA says otherwise. Physics says otherwise." I kept my voice cold, clinical. "Your husband is a criminal who targeted his own daughter. I'm not responsible for the consequences of his choices. What do you want?" Linda's voice broke. "Money? We can pay you back for the property. We can make this right. I want what was always mine. The property, legally transferred with full documentation. I want public acknowledgement of the fraud. I want your husband held accountable for arson, and I want every single person who helped him, every attorney who looked the other way, every employee who falsified documents, exposed and prosecuted. That's everything. We'll have nothing left. Then you'll know exactly how I felt standing in your driveway, watching you close the door in my face." I hung up before she could respond. That night, Jamie and I sat on her balcony, sharing a bottle of wine I'd bought with my first insurance check. The money wouldn't cover everything I'd lost, but it was enough to start rebuilding. "Are you sure about all this?" Jamie asked quietly. "Once you go through with the criminal charges, there's no coming back from it. He's still your father." I thought about that word. Father. What did it mean when the man who gave me life also tried to steal my future? When he chose his new family over his first daughter so completely that he'd rather see me homeless than let me sleep on his couch? He stopped being my father the day he told me to sleep in my car, I said. Maybe even before that. Maybe when he forged my grandmother's signature. Maybe when he met Linda and decided I was inconvenient. I don't know when exactly, but it doesn't matter anymore. Jamie nodded slowly. He has no idea what he created, does he? By pushing you out, by taking everything, he turned you into someone who won't stop fighting. She was right. My father had made a catastrophic error, He'd assumed I was weak, that I'd internalize his rejection, that I'd fade quietly into the background of his new life. Instead, he'd stripped away every reason I had to protect him, and now I was going to take everything he'd stolen, plus everything he'd built on top of it. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning. I didn't witness it personally, but Mrs. Chen's doorbell camera caught it all. 2 unmarked police cars pulling up to my father's house at 6:47 a.m., detectives in suits walking up the driveway, Linda answering the door in her bathrobe, her face crumbling when they showed her the warrant. My father emerged in handcuffs 17 minutes later, wearing the same expression I'd seen that night in his driveway: irritation. As if this were all a massive inconvenience rather than consequences for his actions. The charges were substantial: arson, conspiracy, insurance fraud, criminal property theft, forgery, and fraud against a vulnerable person. The last because I'd been a minor when he'd stolen my grandmother's land. The bail hearing set his bond at $500,000, which he couldn't immediately post because the court had frozen his assets pending the civil fraud case. He spent 4 days in county jail before Linda managed to scrape together the bond by taking out a second mortgage on their house. Meanwhile, my civil case accelerated. The judge had reviewed the evidence, the forged deed, the handwriting analysis, my grandmother's original will, testimony from her estate attorney, and issued a preliminary ruling in my favor. The 12-acre property, including all buildings and improvements, was to be held in escrow pending final judgment. My father's construction company couldn't operate from its headquarters. His employees couldn't access the building. Everything ground to a halt. Within 2 weeks, he'd lost 3 major contracts totaling over $4 million. His bonding company withdrew their backing after learning about the criminal charges. Projects he'd already started were being transferred to competitor firms. Catherine called me with updates delivered in her professionally neutral tone, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath. His attorney is requesting an emergency meeting. They want to settle. No settlements, I said immediately. We're taking this to trial. Morgan, a trial means months of publicity. Your face will be in the papers. Your private life exposed. Are you prepared for that? I thought about all the years I'd stayed quiet, swallowed my hurt, made myself smaller to avoid conflict. I want everyone to know exactly what he did. Every detail, every forged signature, every lie. Let him explain to his friends at the country club why he stole from his grieving teenage daughter and then tried to burn down her house. The preliminary hearing for the criminal charges happened on a gray Tuesday in late November. I sat in the courtroom gallery, watching my father shuffle in wearing an ill-fitting suit, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than I remembered. When he finally glanced back at the gallery and saw me, something flickered across his face. Not remorse, not shame, anger. Pure, undiluted anger that I dared to fight back. I stared back at him with cold clarity, letting him see exactly how little his anger affected me anymore. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. The tampered electrical panel, testimony from my father's employee about the inspection 6 months before the fire, records showing my father had researched house fires and insurance claims in the weeks before my home burned. They'd even found text messages on his work phone where he'd discussed solving the Morgan problem with his accountant. The defense attorney, an expensive hire named Marcus Brent, tried to argue circumstantial evidence and coincidence, but the accumulation of facts was damning. The judge bound everything over for trial, setting a date in March. Walking out of the courthouse, I was stopped by a woman in her 60s, impeccably dressed, who introduced herself as Patricia Brennan. I worked with your grandmother for years at the Children's Hospital Foundation, she said. Helen talked about you constantly. She was so proud of you, so determined to give you security. Her eyes glistened. She'd be proud of you now, too. What you're doing takes tremendous courage. That night, I finally allowed myself to visit the storage unit again and go through more of my grandmother's boxes. Tucked in with her legal documents was a letter addressed to me, dated 2 weeks before she died. My hands shook as I opened it. My dearest Morgan, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I hope it's because you've just turned 25 and claimed what's yours. But I'm also writing this in case something goes wrong, in case your father does what I fear he might. I've seen how Richard changed after your mother died, how he pulled away from you, how he seemed eager to start fresh with Linda. It breaks my heart, but I'm not blind to it. I'm leaving you the Morrison Street property because I want you to have security your father can't control or take away. I've made very clear in my will that the property is only for you, held in trust until you're old enough to manage it. If anyone tells you I gifted it to Richard, they're lying. I would never do that. This is yours, Morgan. Your mother would have wanted you protected. You're stronger than you know, sweetheart. You have your mother's fierce heart and your grandmother's practical head. Don't let anyone convince you to settle for less than you deserve. All my love, Grandma Helen. I sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit and cried for the first time since the fire, not from sadness, but from vindication. My grandmother had known. She'd tried to protect me, and now I was finally claiming what she'd meant for me to have. December brought the civil trial. My father's attorney tried every delay tactic possible, but the judge was unsympathetic. The evidence was too clear, the fraud too obvious. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days, walking the jury through my grandmother's death, my grief, the probate process I'd been too young to understand, the forged deed, discovering the fraud only after losing everything in the fire. I kept my voice steady, my facts precise, my emotions controlled. I wasn't a victim begging for sympathy. I was a woman demanding justice. My father's attorney tried to paint me as opportunistic, money-hungry, exploiting a family tragedy. But then Catherine put Mrs. Chen on the stand, and the jury watched the doorbell camera footage of my father telling me to sleep in my car while his house stood empty behind him. The courtroom went absolutely silent. 2 jurors openly glared at my father. The defense collapsed after that. No character witness could overcome the image of a father turning away his daughter hours after her house burned down. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. They found my father liable for fraud, forgery, theft, and emotional distress. The judgment awarded me the property, now valued at $7 million due to recent commercial development in the area, plus $300,000 in punitive damages, plus all legal fees. My father's face went ashen as the verdict was read. Linda sobbed in the row behind him. I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. I gave them exactly what they wanted. My father stole my inheritance while I was a grieving teenager, then tried to destroy me when I threatened his comfortable life built on theft. This verdict confirms what I've always known, that property was mine, that trust was betrayed, and that justice, however delayed, eventually arrives. That soundbite played on every local news channel that evening. By Christmas, my father's construction company had declared bankruptcy. The criminal trial was still pending, but his reputation was destroyed. Former friends refused his calls. The country club had quietly revoked his membership. Connor and Emma had been withdrawn from their private school. Not expelled, but Linda couldn't afford the tuition anymore. I didn't feel guilty about the children's suffering. Their father had created this catastrophe, not me. And maybe, in some twisted way, they were learning the same lesson I'd learned. That parents aren't infallible, that family isn't sacred when it's built on lies, and that actions have consequences. The criminal trial began in March. Portland's gray winter rain matching the bleak atmosphere inside the courthouse. My father had aged visibly in the 4 months since his arrest. His hair seemed thinner, his expensive suits hanging loose on a frame that had shed weight from stress. The prosecution built their case with methodical precision. They presented the tampered electrical panel, scorched and twisted, with an expert witness explaining exactly how the safety features had been deliberately disabled. They showed the jury photos of my destroyed home, emphasizing that this was arson, not negligence. Someone had intentionally created conditions for a catastrophic fire. Then they called Derek Thompson, my father's former employee, who testified with obvious discomfort about the inspection 6 months before the fire. Mr. Carter told me to loosen some connections in the panel, Derek said, not meeting anyone's eyes. He said the house was old and he wanted to make sure Morgan would notice problems before they got dangerous. But the way he told me to do it, it wouldn't cause immediate problems. It would create a slow buildup, like a ticking clock. Did you ask why he wanted this done? The prosecutor asked. I did. He said Morgan was stubborn and wouldn't accept help unless she thought she needed it. That this would make her more receptive to his assistance. Derek's voice dropped. I didn't realize he meant to burn her house down. I thought maybe he wanted her to smell smoke or see sparks, get scared, call him. I never thought. The defense attorney tried to discredit Derek, suggesting he was testifying to avoid his own prosecution, but the damage was done. The jury had heard a father deliberately sabotaging his daughter's home. Next came the text messages recovered from my father's phone, presented on a large screen for the jury. To Linda. Morgan problem needs permanent solution. Can't have her digging into property issues. To his accountant. If M's house became unlivable, she'd be desperate enough to sign anything. No house, No leverage. To Derek Thompson. Make it look like old wiring failure. Nothing traceable. I watched my father's face as those messages appeared. He closed his eyes, jaw clenched, looking like he might be sick. The prosecution's final witness was me. I walked to the stand in a Navy suit, my hands steady despite the weight of what I was about to do. For 30 minutes, I answered questions about my relationship with my father, the night of the fire, his refusal to help me, my discovery of the property fraud. Then the prosecutor asked, "Ms. Carter, in your opinion, why did your father want your house destroyed?" My father's attorney objected. "Speculation, Your Honor," but the judge overruled him. I looked directly at my father as I answered, because I was the only threat to everything he'd built on stolen land. As long as I had my own home, my own stability, I could fight back. But if I was desperate, homeless, financially destroyed, I'd be easier to control. He needed me broken so I'd never question what he'd taken from me. And now, after everything that's happened, how would you describe your relationship with your father? I didn't hesitate. I don't have a father. Richard Carter is a criminal who happens to share my DNA. That's the extent of our connection. My father flinched like I'd slapped him. The defense tried to salvage things during their case. They called Linda, who testified tearfully about my father's good character, his love for his children, his community involvement. But the prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. "Mrs. Carter, were you present the night your stepdaughter came to your home after losing everything in a fire?" "Yes." "And what did you do to help her?" Linda's face crumpled. Richard thought it would be disruptive to the children. "You closed the door and activated your security system. Is that correct?" "Yes." But no further questions. They called character witnesses, business associates, neighbors, fellow parents from Connor and Emma's school. But none of them could explain away the physical evidence, the text messages, the damning testimony from Derek Thompson. The defense's closing argument tried to paint my father as a man who'd made bad choices under financial pressure, who'd panicked when facing exposure, who never actually intended for anyone to be hurt. But the prosecutor's rebuttal was devastating. Richard Carter didn't just steal from his daughter. He didn't just forge documents and commit fraud. He actively attempted to destroy her life when she threatened to expose him. He sabotaged her home, her sanctuary, her security, and then refused her shelter when his plan succeeded. This isn't a man who made mistakes under pressure. This is a man who methodically, deliberately targeted his own child to protect his lies. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the forewoman read the verdicts in a clear, firm voice. Arson conspiracy, guilty. Insurance fraud, guilty. Criminal property theft, guilty. Forgery, guilty. My father showed no reaction as each guilty verdict was read, his face a blank mask. But when the judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later and remanded him to custody without bail, his composure finally cracked. He turned to Linda, reaching for her hand, but she'd already stood and was walking out of the courtroom, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I stayed seated in the gallery as they led my father away in handcuffs, his expensive shoes shuffling against the polished floor. He looked back once, his eyes finding mine. I held his gaze without expression, giving him nothing, not forgiveness, not hatred, just cold, absolute finality. Outside the courthouse, I gave another brief statement to reporters. Justice has been served. My father will now face consequences for his crimes, just as any other criminal would. I hope this case reminds people that family relationships don't excuse fraud, theft, or violence. Thank you. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was swift. The judge, a severe woman in her 60s, reviewed the pre-sentencing report and addressed my father directly. "Mr. Carter, you held a position of profound trust as a parent. You were meant to protect your daughter, especially after she'd lost her mother. Instead, you exploited her grief to steal her inheritance. When that theft threatened to be exposed, you attempted to destroy her home and leave her destitute. These aren't crimes of passion or temporary lapses in judgment. This was calculated, sustained, predatory behavior targeting your own child." She sentenced him to 12 years in state prison for arson conspiracy, with additional concurrent sentences for the fraud charges. With Oregon's mandatory minimum requirements, he'd serve at least 8 years before being eligible for parole. My father's hands were shaking as they led him away. He was 56 years old. He'd be 64 at the earliest possible release, his construction business gone, his reputation destroyed, his comfortable life completely dismantled. I felt no sympathy, only the quiet satisfaction of a debt finally paid. 2 months after my father's sentencing, I stood on the 12 acres of land my grandmother had left me, watching construction crews break ground on a new project. The property had officially been transferred to my name, free and clear of any claims. My father's construction company headquarters had been demolished, and in its place, I was building something my grandmother would have loved: an affordable housing complex for families recovering from disasters, fires, floods, displacement. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The land stolen from a grieving teenager, used to build a fraudulent business empire, would now house people rebuilding their lives from nothing. I'd partnered with 2 nonprofit organizations to make it happen, using my civil judgment money to fund the initial construction. The complex would have 50 units, all rented at below-market rates to families referred by social services. I'd named it Helen's Place after my grandmother. Jamie stood beside me at the groundbreaking ceremony, both of us wearing hard hats as photographers documented the occasion. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said quietly. "She'd also probably tell me I was being too generous with the bastard's money," I replied with a slight smile. "But I think she'd understand." The media coverage had been overwhelmingly positive. Portland loved the narrative. Daughter overcomes father's betrayal, reclaims stolen inheritance, uses it to help others. Several foundations had reached out about additional funding. The mayor had attended the groundbreaking. I'd gone from my father's inconvenient first daughter to a minor local hero. My father, meanwhile, was serving his sentence at Oregon State Penitentiary. I'd received 3 letters from him in the months since his incarceration, each one carefully preserved but unopened. Whatever he wanted to say, apologies, justifications, pleas for forgiveness, I had no interest in hearing it. That door had closed permanently the night he told me to sleep in my car. Linda had filed for divorce 6 weeks after his sentencing, citing irreconcilable differences and fraud. The divorce was uncontested. My father had nothing left to fight with. She'd moved with Connor and Emma to her parents' home in Seattle, changing the children's last name back to her maiden name. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she was working as a receptionist, struggling to maintain anything close to their previous lifestyle. I'd received a letter from her, too, apologizing for closing the door that night, claiming she hadn't understood the full situation, begging me to have compassion for Connor and Emma, who'd lost everything through no fault of their own. I'd read that letter carefully, then filed it with all the other legal documents from the case. Linda had made her choices, prioritizing her comfortable life over basic human decency. Her children were suffering because their father was a criminal and their mother had enabled him. That wasn't my responsibility to fix. My insurance claim had finally been fully processed, giving me enough to purchase a small townhouse in southeast Portland, 20 minutes from where my destroyed house had stood. It was modest but mine, bought with money I'd earned and saved, untainted by theft or fraud. I'd furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing each piece deliberately rather than rushing to replace what I'd lost. Some things couldn't be replaced. My mother's jewelry, our photo albums, her handwritten recipes, those losses still ached. But I'd learned something valuable. Material possessions could be destroyed, but identity, dignity, and determination couldn't be taken by fire or theft. On a sunny afternoon in May, I received a call from Catherine. The State Bar Association has completed their investigation into David Morrison, the attorney who processed your grandmother's fraudulent deed. His license has been permanently revoked. He's also being sued by 3 other families who believe he helped facilitate similar frauds. Good, I said simply. There's something else, Catherine continued. The district attorney wants to know if you'd be willing to speak at a conference about elder fraud and exploitation. They're trying to educate families about protecting vulnerable relatives during estate planning. I considered it. The idea of telling my story publicly, of helping others avoid what I'd experienced, appealed to me. Yes, I'll do it. That evening, I sat on my small patio with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Carter, this is Connor. I'm using my friend's phone. I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what Dad did. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I thought you should know that Emma and I don't blame you. We understand now. Connor." I stared at that message for a long time. My 9-year-old half-brother, reaching out across the wreckage of our broken family. Part of me wanted to respond, to offer him reassurance that he and Emma weren't responsible for their father's crimes. But another part, the part that had learned to protect myself, to maintain boundaries, to recognize that not every fence needed mending, hesitated. Connor and Emma were innocent, yes, but they were also reminders of the family that had replaced me, the life my father had chosen over his first daughter. I saved the message without responding. Maybe someday I'd reach back. Maybe when they were adults and could understand the full complexity of what had happened. Maybe when enough time had passed that their reaching out didn't feel like it came from Linda's guilt rather than genuine connection. Or maybe never. And I was learning to be okay with that too. 3 years later, I stood at the dedication ceremony for Helen's Place, now fully completed and occupied. 50 families had moved into the affordable units, including 2 families who'd lost their homes in wildfires, and one whose apartment had been condemned due to neglect. The complex had a community center, a playground, and a garden maintained by residents. I'd completed my graduate degree in social work during those 3 years, specializing in family trauma and recovery. I now worked for a nonprofit helping families navigate housing crises, using my own experience to guide others through systems I'd been forced to learn. My father had served 3 years of his sentence. I'd heard he was a model prisoner, participating in educational programs, supposedly finding religion. I felt nothing about that information. He could transform himself all he wanted in prison. It didn't change what he'd done, didn't earn him access back into my life. The property my grandmother left me was now worth close to $4 million due to Portland's booming real estate market. After Helen's Place was built, I'd sold 3 acres to a developer specializing in mixed-income housing, netting enough money to fully fund my nonprofit work and invest in my future. I kept 2 acres adjacent to Helen's Place as green space for the community. I had security now. Financial, emotional, professional. Everything my grandmother had wanted for me. Everything my father had tried to steal. I'd built it myself from the ashes of what he'd destroyed, and it was solid in a way his fraudulent empire never was. On quiet evenings, I sometimes thought about the night I'd stood in my father's driveway, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, being turned away from the only family I had left. That moment had been devastating. It had also been clarifying, because in that moment, I'd learned that I didn't need them. Not their approval, not their shelter, not their version of family that came with conditions and cruelty. I'd learned I was strong enough to stand alone, smart enough to fight back, and determined enough to win. My father had tried to break me, and instead, he'd forged me into someone who wouldn't break. The land my grandmother left me hadn't just been property, it had been a message. A promise that I was worth protecting, worth investing in, worth believing in. My father had tried to silence that message by stealing the land, but all he'd really done was delay my hearing it. Now that message stood as a testament in brick and mortar, in families housed and lives rebuilt, in justice served and dignity reclaimed. Morgan Elizabeth Carter was her grandmother's granddaughter, her mother's daughter, and absolutely nobody's victim. Not anymore. Not ever again.